This is Rob Orsing with Emerging Revolutionary War. Sorry for our technical difficulties. Probably been on there for a few seconds just staring at the screen. Sorry about that. Very happy tonight to have with us historian and author J.L. Bell, who, for many of you all who've been following us for the past many years, has the best blog website that is American Revolutionary War focused. I tell you that all the time about Boston1775.net. It's a fantastic website. If you're looking for any information on Boston, the American Revolution, go there. Just want to say thank you, John, for being here, and looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Rob. Happy to talk to you folks.
And again, sorry for the tech difficulties. I'm a historian, not a techie, but we're doing our best. So last time we had John on with us was back in June of 2024, talking about the long summer of 1774, the long 1774, and all of the events coming up through 1774, focusing on the coercive acts, the Boston Port Act, and many other acts that all of us know that the Parliament put into place after the Boston Tea Party. And so then we also recently had Dr. Cynthia Hatch on with us talking about Fort William and Mary, and a little bit about the powder alarm, different events going in the fall and winter of 1774. And now we're on the just on the cusp of spring of 2025. So we're getting really close to the anniversary of Lexington and Concord, which I know is a big thing going on in Boston. And we invited John to come on with us to talk about some of the events building up, because I think it's very important that we recognize these things don't just take place instantly. That it's a slow build, and no one knows this topic better than John. And so to kind of kick us off here, oh, and I also need to talk about this. I just started to reread this again. Heavily recommend his book here, The Road to Conquer. I'm sure we'll be talking about these four canon sometime this evening as well. So John, after Fort McMurray, as we go into 1775, what's going on in Massachusetts? What are the local communities and towns doing in response to all the events leading up to that time?
Well, at the end of 1774, it is very clear that the lines were drawn, that Boston, where General Thomas Gage, the royal governor, had all his troops, he controlled that, and he didn't control any other part of the province. And all the towns were sending delegates to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which was a sort of rebel or shadow government that was starting to collect taxes, that had been recommending to towns to purge loyalists from the militia and get organized. They were the people who sent out the call to start minute companies. And many towns were taking up that call and organizing these special militia companies. So as 1774 ended, it was quite clear that unless there was a real breakthrough, there was going to be a military solution to this conflict that had been building up for some time. And it was so clear also, where the lines were, Boston and the rest of the province. In January 1775, General Gage sent about 150 troops to a town south of Boston called Marshfield, a town that had a coastline. And that was because they had been invited by a loyalist, a wealthy loyalist in that town named Nathaniel Ray Thomas. And there were enough loyalists in the town to create a little community. And Nathaniel Ray Thomas wanted those men to be supported, guarded. So the soldiers were sent to reinforce this little loyalist company. And the result was that was the one town, the one area of all of Massachusetts that General Gage managed to retake for the crown. It was, a bit of Marshfield around Nathaniel Ray Thomas's estate.
So obviously the different militias and the different towns in Massachusetts are arming. Um, Talk a little bit about that process. What's leading into this? What's the thought process in doing this? Are they doing this in defense, or are they doing this with more an offensive mindset to take on a fight with Gage?
Well, in most wars, both sides think they're on the defensive. Both sides think the other one is pushing too far, and they have to, take up arms to defend themselves. And that was, certainly the case here, where Gage could, count. He had, of course, trained professional troops, but they were far fewer than the Massachusetts militia could muster. And uh, the the minute company system, which was the new thing in the militia, the Massachusetts militia at the time, was something that was sort of proposed by Worcester, which is a sort of militant town in central Massachusetts, and then taken up by the provincial Congress. And the provincial Congress was sort of careful in the language they used. They couldn't require towns to do anything, but they could recommend that towns do things. And one of the things they recommended was to look into the possibility of forming a minute company. Now, a minute company, the idea was that these men would have all the military equipment they would need. Usually, when you showed up for your militia muster, you'd bring your gun. If you didn't have a gun, well, you'd borrow a gun. You'd show up anyway to show willing. You wouldn't have a bayonet. You wouldn't have and part of being a Minuteman was that you were supposed to be equipped with all that stuff, and the community would help you equip yourself. Another part was that you were supposed to drill more, so that you're really excellent at the military drill according to the British Army standards. Because the minute companies drilled more, many of them expected to get extra pay for the extra time and effort they were putting into drilling, but there was no standard. Part of the way the provincial Congress was recommending it couldn't recommend you have to pay this amount for this amount of drilling. So every town came up with a different standard, and you can see in the town records that there's an argument in some towns like should the minute company get extra pay? No, we're all doing extra training, so they shouldn't get any extra pay. And in this one town, the minute company kept coming back to the town meeting month after month, asking what about now? And it didn't. Nothing happened until after the war started. Interestingly, the town of Lexington, which was actually a pretty radical town politically, did not officially create a minute company because its militia were all gung-ho. Whereas a town like Concord, which finally formed its minute company, I think in early January 1775, which was on the late side. They were a more conservative town, but eventually they too got on the bandwagon. So there was the militia was becoming more serious, and the minute companies showed that there was a more commitment of time, men, and equipment in creating a strong army. There was still possibly some hope in the Massachusetts Patriots that if they showed this sort of resolve, that if they showed that they were a dangerous foe, that General Gage would convince his superiors in London to compromise, and there wouldn't have to be war. But it's one of those situations where, in order to prevent war, they were saying you have to prepare for war. And well, sometimes when you prepare for war, that makes war more likely.
It's true. You mentioned the provincial Congress. Let's back up a little bit. Talk a little bit about what that is. Just kind of just an overview of that. And Gage comes in. They dissolve the Massachusetts legislature, but what happens when he tries to reform the legislature? And they moved to Salem there too as well. So what are the efforts that Gage does to reinstitute this legislature and then the provincial Congress born out of that?
Well, under the Massachusetts Charter of the 1690s, which was the official constitution of Massachusetts, there was a royal governor appointed in London, and there was this legislature elected yearly by the towns of Massachusetts. Every town was the average town was supposed to have 2 delegates in the legislature, in the lower house of the legislature. Boston had 4 because it was so big. In fact, that meant it was still disproportionately had less representation, but it was very influential. So Bostonians led. And if you were a very small town, then you might be able to just do 1. Many towns did not send 2 delegates because it was expensive. You had to pay the guy to go, and he had to be willing to take time off from his farm. But this was the way it worked. And under the Constitution, the governor had the right to adjourn the legislature, had the right to absolute veto any laws And then there's the upper house of the legislature, not the House, but or assembly, it was called, but the council. That's a whole different story. Um, the in When General Thomas Gage was made the governor of Massachusetts and arrived in May 1774, he had instructions from London to move this legislature out of Boston up to Salem, which he did. All the legislators, all the delegates went up there grumbling about it. They spent their time secretly choosing to send men to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. As soon as Gage got word of that, he dissolved the legislature, which was his prerogative under the Constitution. But it was too late, and already those men were going to go off to Philadelphia and make more trouble. In September, Gage felt that he was at a certain advantage on the 1st of September, and he put out calls for a new legislature, new elections in all the towns. Then on September 2nd, an event occurred that we talked about last time called the Powder Alarm. There was a militia uprising, thousands of men marching towards Cambridge, and Gage thought, oh, this is not a good time to do the legislature, and he canceled that. But the towns nevertheless called his bluff, and they sent delegates to meet in Salem, as he had originally said, and they waited around for a couple of days, and then they decided to become this provincial Congress, which was therefore a sort of shadow legislature. It had representatives from all the towns. It had this tradition of voting, even though it was not, they recognized they were not the official legislature, not the official house of Massachusetts. They could only do resolutions or recommendations or things like that. They didn't have the treasurer. They had a receiver general. They used language to make the distinction clear. Nonetheless, that was the most important element of government outside of Boston in all of Massachusetts. And interestingly, there was participation from more towns in the provincial Congress than there was in a typical official legislature. So it was definitely a broad-based, popular form of government.
And I guess, I mean, in the strictest form of the word, those men are somewhat, they're extra legal body. They really have no, I mean, I guess treason's a tough word, but you know, they're really being taking some risks in creating this.
This was a province-wide gathering like this was explicitly forbidden under the Massachusetts Government Act, because there had been a convention of towns back in 1768 when troops were first being sent to Boston. And so, yes, this was illegal. On the other hand, they argued that they were the elected representatives of the people. And does that mean more or less legitimacy? Well, that was what all the fighting was about.
Right. And what's Gage's response to this?
Gage realized back in September, after this militia uprising, that he really didn't have the power to do much about this. So he spent his time shoring up the defenses of Boston, both from land and using the Royal Navy to protect them by sea, doing its best to support loyalists out in the countryside, like in Marshfield, and writing to London saying, this is much more important. This is much more serious than you understand.
This is much bigger.
There's a quotation where he says, if you think that 5,000 men is enough, send 20. If you think that, and they didn't believe him. They simply did not believe his analysis of the situation. They thought he was being panicky. They couldn't understand what he meant by suspending the enforcement of the laws. And so by early 1775, as the winter went on, he was really realizing that he was not going to get the sort of support he wanted from London, and he was on his own. And so he had to figure out what to do, given that he really, he had all these troops in Boston, but the rest of the province was out of his control.
Right. So kind of piggybacking on the conversation with the Congress, a lot of people read and see in pop culture the spy network that Warren and Sons of Liberty had there in Boston. But let's talk a little bit about Gage's spy network, because he was very active in trying to get information about what was going on in these town meetings and the provincial Congress.
Yes, this is something that he really did in early 1775. In 1774, he had some of the loyalists coming and providing information directly to him. As prominent loyalists began to feel unsafe in their homes and can't come into Boston, he lost that form of information. But he found some other ways to get information. One is, of course, less visible loyalists. Um, in February of 1775, he began to get reports from within the Committee of Safety, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, which was the committee from the provincial Congress that was working with the Committee of Supplies to create this army. And suddenly, on the first day that Dr. Benjamin Church met with that committee as a delegate, that evening, General Gage was writing down in his intelligence files a lot of information from the Committee of Safety, where they had their artillery pieces, who was working for them, in what towns, and what he had done. Somehow, General Gage had had won over Dr. Benjamin Church, who had been a very visible and high-ranking patriot or Whig among the Boston activists for 10 years. And he was now working for Gage and working for pay. It's quite clear that he was being given money for this information. We know that in late February, Gage made two attempts to learn more or stop what was going on outside of Boston. One is that he sent two spies, a Captain William Brown and an Ensign Henry de Bernier, two British Army officers, but in civilian dress, with their enlisted manservant, out to Worcester to look for cannon, to look for other signs of military buildup, to connect with local loyalists if they could. On that same weekend, he also sent Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie to Salem because he had heard, probably from Dr. Church, that in Salem, a man named David Mason was collecting cannon and preparing them on carriages to be used in warfare. And so Lieutenant Colonel Leslie was on a secret mission with a ship that docked in Marblehead. Hundreds of British regulars filed off suddenly. This was a Sunday, so most locals were at their meetings, and the soldiers marched through Marblehead all the way to Salem, where they bumped up against a drawbridge, a raised drawbridge over a branch of the river in Salem, and they could not pass any further because David Mason had pulled up the drawbridge on the other side and was keeping them away while his people were moving the cannon further away. So these are two operations, one to gather information, the other based on information, which required some spies, some loyalists, some information from the countryside. And yet, when these things happened, they actually made, because these operations sort of exposed people, they actually, I think, made things worse for loyalists in the towns that were affected.
Yeah, and again, I think it's overlooked by a lot of people, the different, how complex the network that Gage had, and how much information he was getting from it.
Yes, and we still don't know.
Right.
There is in March 1775, Gage started to get information from an informer in Concord, writing in atrocious French to disguise himself or herself. And I have been looking for 20 years now, trying to find evidence of who this person is. And I'm still comparing handwritings and things like that. I haven't found it yet. But yes, right. Gage had information from this person as of early April 1775 of exactly where in Concord different armaments were being stored. And if we look at the notes being taken by Colonel James Barrett, colonel of the Middlesex County Militia in Concord, they match. He had accurate information coming out
Wow.
of Concord.
Wow. Well, let's talk about Cannon. I know you know a lot about Cannon this time period. So when did these towns start to try to gather cannon? Because obviously that's a whole different ball game. I think Gage sees that as a real threat. When do they start trying to procure cannon, and what are the things that they do to procure cannon?
This is an interesting question because yes, cannon, because you don't hunt with cannon,
Right.
so they are not regular self protection or they are military weapons, and so when the militia starts to gather cannon, that is clearly a preparation for war. And they started to gather cannon in early September 1774, even before the Massachusetts Provincial Congress gathered. This was a case where the movement, the action was coming from the bottom and pushing the politicians along, so that we see in early September 1774, the people in Charlestown next to Boston, the people in Dorchester next to Boston are pulling the guns that are on their shorelines to protect against invasion by the French or the Spanish from sea, pulling those back and starting to probably figure out how to put them on carriages to be used in a battle against the king's army if necessary. And that continued throughout September. In the middle of September, there were the 4 stolen cannon from Boston that are at the center of my book, and that really caught Gage's attention. And then as things went along, there were cannon being pulled out of batteries. There were cannon being taken off of ships. There were hardware stores that had leftover cannon from the last war down in their basement, and those were suddenly being sold at a premium. So that, and then the more difficult task for the patriots out in the countryside was to take these big metal tubes, which they're good, but they have to be on carriages. They have to be mounted on something, or else they're just big, heavy things. And those carriages have to be well made and durable. And so that was the real bottleneck. And we can see that there's a moment when 8 cannon are sent out from Charlestown and Watertown to different towns, Weston, Lexington, and each town is supposed to undertake to mount 2 cannon. So spreading the work around, spreading the expense around, and the work does not proceed fast because it is expensive and it is tough. And there are people going back to their town meetings and saying, "Oh, do we have to?" And Watertown cut its school budget in order to pay for the cannon, and so this work was probably going rather slowly out in the countryside, and that's one reason why there were no cannon involved in the battle on April 19th. But there were at least 3 dozen cannon being deployed in and around the countryside, probably close to 50 if you count in those that were not directly under the control of the provincial Congress.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
immediately after the war starts, there are cannons being installed around the siege lines in Boston.
sure.
They were already ready to go in some way.
So before we jump into the 4 cannon in your book, because I want to talk about that, let's go back to Salem really quick, since I know we're coming up February 26th on the 250th anniversary of Leslie's retreat, Salem alarm, however you want to call it. What were the lessons learned by Gage during that event? I mean, they're really close to. It's amazing nothing worse didn't happen at that event.
Yes.
What did that teach Gage?
Well, one thing he clearly learned or took from that was that he needed to stop the spread of news before in front of the soldiers, because by the time his men under Colonel Leslie reached that bridge, it had been pulled up. And if he had, I mean, they got off the ship as quickly as possible. They marched as quickly as possible, and yet, of course, they could not stop people running or riding ahead. And so that is one thing that we see happening in April, is that Gage sent out officers on horseback to stop alarm riders from warning the towns that there were soldiers on the way. He also sent out many more people in April than he did in February. It was quite clear after the regulars were stopped at the bridge in Salem, the other towns in Essex County started to mobilize their militia companies, and they were coming to the other side of the bridge and watching. And so it was quite possible, and Gage understood this, that could have led to a battle in the middle of Massachusetts' second largest settlement, Salem and Marblehead. And it didn't, because basically Leslie realized that he could not carry the day, and he insisted that he would carry out his orders exactly. So his orders were to go to the forge across the river, and so he convinced the Patriots to let down the bridge, let him go across, and immediately return, because he knew that by that time the forge had been emptied of anything incriminating. Right. So that is why it's called Leslie's Retreat, a later name. Mm-hmm. And Colonel Leslie did prominent things later in the war, but that was not his best day. But at the same time, he did get all his men back safely. And so, given that it was not going to, that was the best outcome that he could imagine, that was fine. So Gage, in thinking about Concord, he did adjust his plans somewhat, but it was still the same basic mission. We hear that there are cannon out in this town in these specific places. Let us march as quickly as possible and try to grab them. And once again, it didn't work.
Right. As far as through the eyes of the militia and the provincials, do you think that what happened in Salem emboldens them? Like, does that give them a sense of security, that the regulars aren't going to fire on us when we confront them?
That's an interesting question. I think they actually, their first thought was, okay, the British Army, the regulars, are actually trying to, they are coming into our towns. There was, yes, a feeling that a big response, a big unified show of force had been effective. So yes, I believe they thought they would do that again. I don't think they were thinking that the regulars would never fire on them. I don't think they were lulled into a false sense of security there, or at least not many of them. They did pull those cannon out of Salem and move them into the countryside where they would be farther away.
So let's talk about the four cannon, that a focus of your book. If you could briefly tell the story about these four cannon, and then go into a little bit your theory on Gage's response to losing these four guns. I know it's a big question, it's a big story, it's a great book, but it's a lot to synopsize in a podcast. But if you could do your best, that'd be
all right.
Great.
These four cannon belong to the Boston Militia Regiment, a specialized artillery company within that regiment called the Train. And they were used from 1768 on in like war games on Boston Common, in training. They were the only brass guns in the Massachusetts militia at the time, so they really stood out. And the Bostonians were proud of them and proud of this company. In September 1774, after the powder alarm, after General Gage started to protect the town, put his own artillery pointing out of Boston at the countryside, bringing the ships around, suddenly all the cannon that were left in Boston became very valuable. And the artillery company, the Train, broke up, basically. They didn't, most of the men didn't side with their commander, who was a loyalist. He provided the keys to the gun houses, the small armories in the center of town to the British officers. And in mid-September, overnight, one night, they discovered, the officers discovered that a hole had been knocked in the back wall of one of the armories, and the two guns inside there were gone. So they put a stronger guard on the other armory. A couple days later, an officer came to take the two guns out of that armory. They opened it up, and the two guns there were gone as well. The militia company's own men, it looks like, had spirited away these guns and hidden them in town for a few months. And in the book, I explain exactly how they managed to do that. In one case, and where they went. And then by early 1775, they were moving these cannons out of Boston into the countryside, to Roxbury, to Dorchester. They spent some time under a dung heap at the Liberty Tree Tavern in Dorchester. And then Dr. Joseph Warren began to hear that a blacksmith who had helped hide two of the cannon was talking about doing jobs for the British Army. And Warren conferred with a colleague, and there's a letter from him to Samuel Adams saying, "We are convinced that we can no longer trust this man, and we have to move the cannon further out from Dorchester so that he doesn't know where they are and can't tell General Gage," which was all very wise, except the one colleague he conferred with on this plan was Dr. Benjamin Church, who then immediately went and told General Gage. So that is why when they were moved out from Dorchester, where they were moved to was Concord. They were in the town of Concord. They were at in a cellar on Colonel James Barrett's farm. I think because these cannon were so valuable, the colonel himself was keeping track of them. And yet a couple of days before April 19th, he was getting worried enough. Paul Revere actually came out with messages from the Boston leadership and so on, that he had most of the war material at his farm moved farther out. And the four cannon were among those things. I think they probably were moved to a smaller town called Stowe.
So Gage's reaction when he finds...
Gage's reaction, I argue that every time Gage takes any aggressive action and he sends out troops, he is looking for not only cannon, not only weapons, but these particular cannon, because they had disappeared on his watch. From armories that actually had his soldiers out in front of them, and yet they were gone. I think that, and he never actually told his superiors in London that these things had happened. He was keeping it secret, it looks like. So when he sent his Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier as spies out to Worcester, well, that was after he had heard that there were cannon out in Worcester. When he sent Lieutenant Colonel Leslie to Salem, he was actually told that there were brass cannon in Salem. There weren't, but that was what he was operating on. And then he had to explain, because that was such a visible operation, and then he explained to his bosses in London why he did that, and he made up a story that there had been cannon that had been smuggled in from Holland. That's not what his intelligence files said. So that was an excuse that he knew that they would buy in London. And then finally, he started to concentrate on Concord. He sent Brown and de Bernier out to Concord. They confirmed that the Boston guns were out there. He had this man or woman writing to him in atrocious French, confirming that the guns were out there, and that was where he was focused on. So even though the instructions from London, which arrived in early April, told him that the ministry in London, even the king, thought that the first thing to do would be to arrest the leaders of the rebellion, he did not arrest people. He did not order the arrest of Adams and Hancock. He did not order the arrest of Dr. Warren inside Boston. He ordered men to go look for the cannon, because I think that was his priority, and as also what he probably thought, given his information, might have been the easiest mission.
Yeah, I think it's a great story. It's almost like a child trying to fix something that they broke before the parents find out about
Yes,
it.
and it's I always have to acknowledge that if anybody finds a letter, a report that I've overlooked where he just says Viscount the Viscount Secretary of War Barrington how actually they took away cannon. Can you believe these people? Luckily, they were dinky little cannon. It doesn't really matter. Then my theory's out the window. But I have been looking for that for 25 years, and I have not found it. And I don't think it existed. And the fact that he was, as I say, with the Salem expedition, making up a reason why he ordered it, I think he was trying to cover himself, and it eventually blew up in his face.
Right. Um, so you mentioned you kind of referred a little bit to the orders of arresting certain leaders there, Whig leaders in Massachusetts. I think that's one of the biggest myths that you hear a lot when you visit historic sites up there or read certain books that talk about that one of the goals of the mission that Gage sends out is to arrest Hancock and Adams. Um, how have you kind of tried to battle that? I mean, I know when you give talks in your blog, you're
Mm-hmm.
very open and honest about why you think that, and I think you're right. And I think you have a great. I mean,
Well,
there's no orders for that. Gage never gives
exactly.
any orders, so it's pretty
Exactly.
easy. But
There are no orders for that. There's General Gage's intelligence files do not show he was tracking where they were. There no British officers went out to the parsonage where Hancock and Adams were and
right,
tried to find them or chased after them. There was a moment earlier during the march on April 18th when or early April 19th, when the column passed right by a tavern where three other members of the Committee of Safety had
mm-hmm.
been hiding. And they passed right, and a member of the Committee of Safety drove his carriage right past them. And they didn't try to stop or arrest any of these guys. They
Right,
were after the cannon. However, it is true that the London government thought that arresting the leaders made sense, and it looks like the Massachusetts Patriots had good intelligence of what London was reporting, because as soon as that message seemed to arrive, or even a little bit before, as soon as ships from London arrived uh, uh, in like April 14th, April 15th, Boston Patriot leaders were scattering out of the town clerk packed up all the town records and left Boston. His brother, the Reverend Samuel Cooper, left Boston suddenly in the middle of a Sunday. The printers, Eads and Gill of the Boston Gazette and Isaiah Thomas of the Massachusetts Spy, packed up and left Boston. Well, Gill didn't, and then he got jailed for that, but Eads left Boston with a press. So there were people staying out of town. There's even Hancock and Adams chose to be out in Lexington, not at their homes in Boston, because they were fearing arrest. So there was this great deal of fear of arrest. So it was not unreasonable to fear that the regulars were going out to try to arrest Hancock and Adams. And that is also what Paul Revere's mission was, and William Dawes's mission. Dr. Joseph Warren sent them out to warn Hancock and Adams, who actually already knew that soldiers were on their way because they had heard that British officers on horseback were headed their way earlier in the day. So I think there's partly it's a logical thing for historians to think, Gage wanted to arrest these men, and partly it's because once we've put so much emphasis on Paul Revere's mission, well, his mission was to uh, uh, get Hancock and Adams, make sure that they were safe. Once we, as a culture, think that that's important, then we believe that that was crucial. And in fact, I would argue that if Hancock had not left, if he had insisted on staying, and he spent hours arguing that they should stay in Lexington. If he had stayed in Lexington with his sword and his pistol and standing at the door of the parsonage and saying, you will not arrest me, you will not," the British column would have passed by half a mile away. They wouldn't have looked at him. It wouldn't have been. He did not need to flee,
right.
but Samuel Adams convinced him that it was important that he actually get out of there, and so they did.
So why do you think Gage, and maybe this is maybe kind of supposition, but why do you think Gage didn't order their arrests? Like he had these orders we could. He obviously didn't think it was important. Was he worrying about creating a martyr? Was he worried about how that would make things worse, maybe?
I think that there were a number of factors. One is that, as I say, I think he was making a priority of the canon. Secondly, I think that he and the British government did want to follow constitutional norms, and so they waited and waited until they actually had enough of a case to make a criminal case against these men, and until Parliament had voted that Massachusetts, to say that Massachusetts was officially in rebellion, which they did 250 years ago today, February 2nd. And they needed to get all those ducks in a row because they were actually trying to follow the law and the British Constitution. And third, yes, there were some practical issues. You would think that Hancock and Adams, I mean, they're two men. They're more mobile. They're easier for them to move around than cannon that are hundreds of pounds, you'd think. Now, as it turned out, when the march happened, as I said, Hancock spent 3 hours in Lexington arguing that he shouldn't leave, and meanwhile over in Concord the cannon were already out of there because James Barrett had moved them. So Hancock was actually harder to move than the cannon, but I don't think, in practical terms, that might have not have been possible. And yes, that would have. It's possible that would have created martyrs. Either if the men were in custody or if they were hurt or killed during capture. But when we look at other events, like there's a moment in the summer of 1774 when General Gage detained members of the Salem Committee of Correspondence because he wanted them to stop a town meeting from taking place. The culture did not really hold up individuals as martyrs unless they actually died. And it was much more of a collective action. And so one other possibility is that Gage might have realized more than London that if you arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, then there are going to be 6 other men already working on this, and the rebellion is going to continue. Throughout the entire pre-revolutionary period, and even into the war, loyalists and the British government in London had this idea that there was just this thin layer of troublemakers at the top, and if you could just peel those guys away and then the vast population was loyal and acquiescent and would be pacified again. And what happened in the summer of 1774 in Massachusetts was that, in fact, that big mass of the populace became more militant than the leaders in Boston. And so there would probably, even if the soldiers had arrested Hancock and Adams, there would probably still have been a uprising from the people. And Gage might well have sensed that and felt that, if there's going to be an uprising one way or another, it's better for me and my cause to make sure they have fewer artillery pieces and make sure that my particular standing in London remains solid.
Right. Just touching a little bit on April 19th, not the focus of what I asked you to talk about tonight, but I have to ask you, just talk about the men that Gage sent out, the regulars on horseback to kind of stop the riders and try to blend in with the area, which obviously wasn't very successful.
Yes, Gage.
Did Gage think that was going to work? I mean,
I think so. I mean, each time he would do something, he would, he's doing more than he did in Salem by sending out Major Edgar Mitchell and some other officers on horseback ahead of the march. And they did stop Revere. They did stop Dawes. They did stop three young men from Lexington who had volunteered earlier to ride from Lexington to Concord to warn the people in Concord that the soldiers might be on their way. They just didn't stop one guy, Dr. Samuel Prescott, who got through,
Right.
and they didn't stop others. Same thing that happened in Medford. We all know the story of the two signal lanterns, the 2 of Phi C signals from the Old North Church across Charles River to Charlestown, and the patriots in Charlestown put a rider on a horse to ride out, and he was going to be go all the way to Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams, and he appears to have been stopped by officers on horseback in the next town in Medford, and we don't know who he was. He just disappears, and so again, those officers were actually successful. They also put Paul Revere off his route, and he had to take the long route around to get all the way to Lexington. So, on the one hand, they didn't succeed in stopping the alarm entirely, but they did stop several riders. And it's just that if you're going to take that strategy, you have to be batting 100%. You have to stop all the riders, or somebody's going to get through, especially at a time like this when the countryside was already on the alert for anything that would happen. As it turned out, I think that actually Major Mitchell and his half a dozen or so men, they set off the alarm, which they were supposed to stop, because we know that when they arrived in Lexington, people saw them, saw that they were armed with pistols, saw that they were wearing uniforms under their cloaks, and that was when Sergeant William Monroe mustered a guard at the parsonage over Hancock and Adams. That's when he went to Captain John Parker and warned him that there might be more people coming. So although that was not the general alarm yet, that was already starting. People were on tenterhooks.
Yeah, I think they tipped their hat. They tipped them off before the riders came out, like you just mentioned. You had these people riding around armed, kind of not from the area, and they stood out.
Yeah, yeah,
stood out.
And Gage had tried to have marches out of Boston and into the nearby towns, just to quote unquote exercise the men, but also to make people in those towns used to seeing soldiers marching through and thinking, oh, they're just exercising. And actually, it didn't calm them enough. I'll say that. I mean, they tended still to be on the alert. Presumably, same thing with British officers riding out for exercise and just enjoying their horses. But in this case, we know that it didn't work. We know we have the the alerts that they set off in Cambridge, in Lexington.
So, in all your research and reading about all the different letters and reports to the Provincial Congress, do you think they had a sense that the other American colonies were with them, even if it came to armed conflict? We're getting ready to hit the anniversary of Patrick Henry's speech here in Richmond, Virginia, where the speech is amazing. Everyone knows the speech, but it's the motion that he passes that is the big news, really. Virginia starts to arm itself, right? So before Lexington happens, so you can see these colonies kind of coming together. But do you think the people in Massachusetts, the leaders, knew that the other colonies would support them if it came to arms? Military action took place. Do you think they had that kind of in the back of their mind when they were kind of doing all these things to get ready for a possible armed conflict?
Well, they knew that the other New England colonies, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, were going to be behind them. And in fact, there are documents showing that they were earlier in April 1775 actually sending sort of liaisons to the other governments to discuss the details of these things. And so that would be a fairly formidable force. I think they also, they probably were pretty sure of Virginia, because Virginia was so militant. They might have been a little worried about some of the other colonies, but it was quite clear that from the First Continental Congress that all the colonies from South Carolina up to New Hampshire were trying to be united. It was they did the Massachusetts Patriots did work hard to make sure that their story of the British being the aggressors, of the sad death of their side, got out and got all the way through the colonies, so that they were seen as being on the defensive, as being the victims. They had also worked fairly hard back in the fall of 1774 at the First Continental Congress to try to portray themselves not as religious zealots, which was, the New England history, what people, the Quakers of Pennsylvania had in the back of their mind when they thought about New England. And they had actually done a successful job of making these alliances. So there was still this, I think, still some worry about how much the other colonies would support. Would they just give lip service? And that was when the strategy was developed, and that in order to have the Continental Congress take on the army of New Englanders that had formed around Boston after the Battle of April 19th and was there through the end of the year, one part of that strategy was to have a person appointed by the Continental Congress, not from New England, be the commander-in-chief. And that was, of course, George Washington.
Right.
And at the same time, the Continental Congress agreed to pay for more companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland to come up. So they were, and then also to commission General Schuyler in New York to be there. So it took several weeks, a fair amount of arguing over the details, but it looks pretty clear that the Congress was going to support Massachusetts in some way. And the question was, how strongly they would do it, and what did Massachusetts need to do politically to maximize that support.
Right. It's great information. So much to talk about. Again, I want to thank you for being here. I know you have a full slate of talks coming up. I bet your phone and email has been ringing off the hook. Any future research projects you're working on right now?
I am still working on what happens with the artillery in Massachusetts after April 19th. There are sources on the 20th of refugees coming out of Boston and meeting the guns being moved into place. We know that there are fortifications being built within weeks, ringing the town, and one of them, the big fort in Roxbury, has a cannon that is larger than any of those that are brought from Fort Ticonderoga and the Lake Champlain sites later early the next year. So there was a lot of artillery around there, but in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the artillery regiment really disgraced itself and sort of fell apart organizationally. And by when General Washington finally did arrive and took command, he pretty quickly realized in the summer of 1735 that he had to do something to make this unit of the army function well. And that would be what the book is about.
Great. I look forward to that. Well, thanks again, and everyone watching. Please pick up, if you haven't already got a copy, pick out Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. And again, the Boston 1775 blog is fantastic. I have no idea how you keep that up as much as you do. That's amazed by the information on that blog.
Well,
So
thank you. I enjoy it. I enjoy hearing from people. So I'm glad other people are out there enjoying it as well.
And I'm sure it's going to get a lot of hits in the next couple of months as we start gearing up toward April 19th, 2025. Well, thank you again for being here, Mr. Bell, and thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Let's see. Yes.